Hello and welcome to part one of answering question one, how do you know, of the AQA GCSE History Paper 1, Understand the Modern World, Section B, The Wider World, your depth study. This video is part one of part two and is focused on the format of the question. Part two will focus more on how you actually answer the question. So before moving on, I just want to go through a few guidelines with the video today. Firstly, put your phone away, ideally in another room, and if you are on a desktop computer, please close your other tabs. If you are watching this video on your phone, that's fine, but make sure to just do that. Watch the video on the phone. Secondly, you'll need a pen and paper. These videos will be active, as that's the best part or the best way in which you can learn. I will tell you when you need to be active. You can either pause the video or I'll be letting it run for a certain amount of time based on the activity in question. And finally, make sure after the video and before the next video to review the material, because as you hopefully know that you need to encounter the material in a number of times and a number of ways in order for it to go into your long-term memory. So what I'm going to start by showing is the schema of actually the lesson, so the process, sorry, not the lesson, the actual question, the process by which you should be going about thinking about the material before I quiz you on what you've just seen. So the first thing to note, and you're welcome to be copying this down, but I'm more interested in you thinking about the format of the question, is this is question one, which I've already touched on. Now, the actual format of question one, as you may or may not know, is it is worth 4 marks. Now, 4 marks, it roughly equates to about, you say, 6 minutes. I'll talk about this in more detail, but this is actually a really important part of question one and where people often go wrong, not thinking about the marks in relation to the minute. The second key part of question one is understanding and spotting what source type we have. Now, there are 2 source types. Either it will be written or it will be a visual source. You'll see that with other questions you may get both if there are 2 sources, but given there's only 1 source here, it will only be written or visual. Now, that source, and then the question, will have a proposition. So does the written or visual source do one of 2 things? It could either be supporting what we'll see is the tail of the question, the topic, or it will be opposing it. This will make more sense when you see how the questions look. Okay, but be considering the fact that the source they've chosen, it will be clearly doing one of those things, either supporting something or opposing it. Now, what I mean by the topic is what comes at the end of the question. So you've got a picture of a cat there with its tail into a question mark. This is the question tail. More on this in a bit, but this is how you know what the source is about and also what you should be focusing on when you answer the question. Now, what are you analysing? Because it's a source. 3 things, really. And I'll talk about that in a bit, how much of each you have to do. Firstly, the content of the source, so what's inside the source. Secondly, the W's, who, what, where, when, why, which you may remember actually are also known as the source's provenance. And finally, and this is what links content and the provenance in terms of your answer, the contextual knowledge or your own knowledge of the topic in the question tail. So once you've done all these, or once you've gone through this process, format, source types, the proposition, the topic, what needs to be analyzed, then you can actually do the answering, or what needs to be answered. Now, the way it is answered is by explaining. It seems obvious to point out, but you need to make sure you are fully aware of the fact that you have to explain your answer. So let's just see how much you've been listening. I'm going to leave the video playing for 2 minutes. I'd like you to go through these, write them down, and fill in the blanks. So you should have 6 answers. I'm going to start 2 minutes now. Okay, those are your 2 minutes. Let's actually check the answers. Do actually tick or fill in and correct the answers, and this will be something you can keep as well. Hopefully that you got most, if not all, of those. I won't go through them because you can see it all on the board. But now what we'll do is we'll go through some of the schema, but in a bit more detail. Okay, and feel free to actually write down these points, but there'll be a quiz at the end anyway to see how much you're taken in. So going back to the format, I touched on the fact that it is 4 marks, which should therefore be 6 minutes. The reason why this is so important to understand is that this is only 9% of the paper. So one point that I often say to students is you may want to think about doing it last and not spending too much time on it, which is perhaps one of the biggest issues. So you need to be brief but precise, and I think crucial is not overwriting. So you don't need 2 paragraphs. You need 1 precise paragraph that does all the things which need to be done. Secondly, the source type. Now, interestingly, people often find the visual source harder than the written source, which I'll come on to on a later video. But one way to make sure that we understand how to answer the source question is making sure we're aware that sources are contemporary to the period. So the examiner is going to be picking a source that, as we'll see, it will support or oppose, but it should be very, very clear because it is you can take me to the period. Now, linked to that is that it's not an interpretation. Sources are not interpretations. That's often a common error. Um, and you need to make sure that you don't get that mixed up. You'll see interpretations in the other side of the paper or part one. So, on to the proposition. Now, I know this makes more sense once you've got the tail of the question, but this is again an area where students go wrong, not actually understanding whether the source is supporting or opposing something. Now, this is the first thing that kind of really better determines your answer, because up until now that we just know about the format of the question and whether it's a visual or a written source, do think about the fact that this unit is about your conflict and tension, so it will be very, very clear that the source should be supporting or opposing a side. And finally, have a think about the fact that they may use different words to support and oppose. So for oppose, it could be criticize, and support, it could be in favor of. And as I said there, spot the synonym or the other word, which means the same thing. Now, this is linking to the last bit, okay? What is the topic? And it will always be clear right at the end of the question, okay? So this is the second thing that determines your answer. You need to have to think about the source in terms of it supporting or opposing, and it could be the USA, that could be the tail, it could be the USSR, it could be NATO, it could be the Khrushchev. So very, very important. And again, the students who miss it or don't spot it, that's the biggest error, because they will then be writing about something that has nothing to do with what the question is asking. Moving on then to what needs to be analysed. Now, content, as you can see from the arrow, it's literally what is in the source. Now, I said earlier that the visual ones are harder often for students than the written, because I think people aren't precise about what they see. So you want to be very specific. If there's a facial expression, you want to say what that facial expression is. So that's the content, what's in the source. Provenance, okay, is, and you'll see it, usually it's actually written above the source, okay. It will say who created the source. It will also, based on what you can see, be able to see what kind of source it is, although it may say this is a cartoon. Linked to that is where the source is from, by country, or it could be, your which actual newspaper. When, it will always do with the date. And then the why, that's for you to infer, but I think be a bit careful about answering why in this question, because it can lead to overwriting. And then the contextual knowledge is what's in your brain already about the topic, which is in the tail of the question. So I'm going to put this on the board just so you can think about the fact that it can be content and or provenance. I say this because you don't have to do both in detail, and you can actually link them together to explain how you know that the source supports or opposes a side. And again, as I said before, be brief but precise with this. And I think you've got to link the content and the provenance to your own knowledge. You have to show off that you actually know some information about the topic in the tail of the question. Now, once you've thought about all this, you can then be going to actually answer the question. Okay. Now, you've got to explain. Now, AQA actually define explain as set out reasons for, which is actually a very good definition. And it makes you think the fact that you have to justify your reasoning. Okay, so what in the source, be it content or provenance, that links to your own knowledge, demonstrates that the source supports or opposes a side, which is in the tail of the question. Now, again, Be very careful about going into just describing the source, easily done, or going at the other end, going into the utility or the usefulness of the source, or even the reliability of the source. That is not what this question asks. This question is asking, how do you know? So, to finish then, or sorry, just define learning task, okay? Thinking about how you should answer question one, you've got 7 different things you need to do to answer. I want to choose 3 of them. So there are, but amongst these 7, 3 correct points. I'm going to give you a little bit less time for that, and you can just write down the number or just consider it. I'm going to give you a minute for that. Okay, that was a minute. You'll see in the next slide, green are the ones that are to do with answering the question, red are the incorrect ones. So, firstly, as I said earlier, don't spend more than 6 minutes on it. You need your time for the rest of the paper. 2 and 3, yes, you need to analyze the content and/or provenance, and you need to consider the tail of the question. 4, and you don't need to explain how useful the source is, nor do you need to, number 5, write 2 paragraphs, which links into number 6. You need to write 1 paragraph, and you need to link to your contextual knowledge. Okay. So finally, just to remind you about what we had a look at today, about the 6 aspects of your question 1 that will help you understand how to answer question 1 and how to answer, I think, sources in general. Please make sure to have a review of this material before you watch the next video.